In Mexico City, during excavation work in 1978 near the cathedral, a heavy slab was unearthed, decorated with magnificent bas-reliefs that someone a very long time ago had smashed and buried. Researchers wondered who could have smashed this beautiful work of art, and why. To find these answers, we have to go back in time to the year 1519, when Mexico City, one of the world's largest and most populated cities, did not yet exist. In its place was an extraordinary and incredible city, Tenochtitlán. This was the capital and the heart of the grandiose Aztec Empire. The monarch, who had the power of life and death over his subjects, was Montezuma II, descendant of another Montezuma, the great leader who founded the empire and built the grand monuments at Tenochtitlan. Like his ancestor, Montezuma was a highly religious sovereign, particularly devoted to the god Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, to whom hundreds of temples were dedicated. Quetzalcoatl was an extremely benevolent god, the only god in the Aztec pantheon opposed to human sacrifices. The sacred texts state that the god had left the land promising that he would return to redeem his people. And according to the Aztec calendar, the year 1519, by our current calendar, ended one of the sacred cycles. This meant that Quetzalcoatl would soon return, and that's what Montezuma thought when he heard of the floating mountain on the sea. But in 1519, it was not a god that arrived, but conquistador Hernán Cortés. And the floating mountain was a Spanish galleon full of soldiers and weapons. Thinking he was a god, the Aztecs received Cortés with honors and adulation. In return, Cortés went on to destroy the Aztec capital and exterminate its population. Montezuma died, and his successor, Cuitlahuac, was forced to surrender. But how was such a rout possible? The invaders wielded devastating weapons and equipment completely unknown to the indigenous population: cannons, rifles, pistols, and horses, which proved to be formidable war machines. The conquistadors inadvertently brought another devastating weapon, a viral disease, smallpox. Smallpox found virgin territory in the New World. Millions died, over 2/3 of the Aztec population. Among them, the last king, Cuauhtémoc, whose death marked the end of the great ancient civilization of the Aztecs. Maybe if there were no disease, the Aztec soldiers might have fared better against the invaders. They were considered noble warriors and often used predators like eagles as their symbols of strength. These 6-foot statues, now in the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City, depict how they would have looked. The statues once guarded the gates to a temple called, appropriately, Temple of the Warriors. Tenochtitlan was a grand city that stood in the middle of a large lake on a plateau surrounded by mountains. The first inhabitants of the area were tenacious souls who did not shy away from hardship. They transformed their settlement into one of the most extensive and populous metropolises of the then-known world. Their projects included dams, canals, and the draining of swamps. When the soldiers would come back from victorious battles with their spoils of war, they would visit the big market of Tlatelolco. Here they might try to bargain for some precious fabric or rare bird feathers to enrich their attire. Tlatelolco stood at the present site of Mexico City's Plaza de la Tres Culturas. Remains of the ancient Aztec market are still found here, along with traces of a more recent past. Archaeologists have unearthed a main pyramid, rebuilt 14 times, along with other pyramids, platforms, stairs, and altars. In the middle of the plaza stands the Baroque church of Santiago de Tlatelolco, and not far off, the modern-day Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Unfortunately, to build this skyscraper and the adjacent road, the pyramid of Quetzalcoatl and a minor temple dedicated to his worship were sacrificed. Tlatelolco probably wasn't much different from a modern Mexican market. The faces, the voices, the smells, and the many colors of the fruits, vegetables, spices, meats, and other goods for sale are probably the same. Europeans owe the richness of their cuisine to the peoples of America. Until they discovered the New World, they knew nothing of potatoes, tomatoes, corn, peppers, or eggplant. At Tlatelolco, fabrics, skins, pottery, and other commonly used objects were displayed and traded by Aztec merchants called Pochtecans. They would hawk their goods not for currency like gold coins, but in trade for precious cocoa beans. The market was the commercial heart of their world, but it was also the unfortunate theater for the last desperate resistance by the Aztecs during the siege of their capital in the year 1521. After the Spaniards conquered the area, they started building structures of their own, like the Cathedral of Mexico City. But instead of quarrying for new stones, they used stones from an Aztec temple dedicated to the god Quetzalcoatl. Construction of the cathedral was begun in 1573, but 250 years would pass before it was finished, ending up as a mix of very different styles. In spite of great efforts to consolidate its foundations, the cathedral is now unavoidably sinking into the swampy ground, an ironic end to a monument erected by the conquistadors to erase all traces of the glorious Tenochtitlán. Until the year 1978, it appeared as though the invaders had succeeded in their malicious intent. But then something completely unexpected happened. During excavation work for the Mexico City subway, workers digging a trench near the cathedral stumbled upon pieces of a gigantic and mysterious oval stone with a diameter of over 7 feet and a weight of nearly 9 tons. The stone was immediately identified as an Aztec relic and was truly an extraordinary find, inaugurating a new era for modern Mexican archaeology. The earth would soon yield the ancient vestiges of Tenochtitlan, an exceptional discovery comparable to that of the city of Troy. The archaeologist in charge of the work couldn't have had a more apt name: Eduardo Matos Montezuma. He decided to demolish a whole block of the modern city and give back to Mexicans the heart of their ancient capital. From the many relics that have now been discovered, scientists are able to imagine how the magnificent ancient capital might have looked. The center of Tenochtitlan, situated between the cathedral and the Palacio Nacional on the Grand Plaza of the Zócalo, was mainly a place of worship, full of temples erected on the tops of pyramids with their characteristic steep stairways and colorful wall paintings. The city, at an elevation of over 6,500 feet, was surrounded by the lake, hills, and mountains. It was connected to the mainland by many causeways and interlaced with navigable canals. It was a great metropolis with over 1,200,000 inhabitants. The ceremonial center, Teocalli, had many temples dedicated to important gods. The most imposing was the Templo Mayor, the religious heart of Tenochtitlán, the destination for pilgrims and home for priests and divinities. Only priests were allowed to climb to the top of the pyramid and enter the two temples. On either side of the temple, there were two other sacred constructions dedicated to the gods Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca. Teocalli also had dwellings reserved for those in the priesthood and playing fields for an Aztec ball game, which had more of a spiritual meaning than a sporting one. The players were the priests themselves. And lastly, there was the famous Altar of the Skulls, the Tzompantli, where the craniums of human sacrifice victims were displayed. For the Aztecs, religious rites and sacrifices were a necessity, the only way to earn the benevolence of the gods. They believed they were warding off famine, natural disasters, and defeats in battle. And the greatest sacrifice they could make was a human one. The priests made them lie on their backs on narrow sacrificial stones, then cut open their chests and pulled out pulsating hearts as an offering to the idols before them. This description by a Spaniard illustrates one of these sacrifices, made in honor of Huitzilopochtli, the god of the sun and war. There were quite a lot of Aztec gods that demanded human sacrifices. Tlaloc, the god of rain. Coatlicue, the earth goddess, depicted as an old masked woman wearing a narrow skirt tied at the waist with a belt of serpents. Xutecutli, god of fire. Mayahuel, goddess of inebriating beverages, especially the most popular at the time, pulque. The excavation work of ancient Tenochtitlan lasted 5 years and brought to light over 7,000 objects, including sculptures, small artifacts, votive offerings, and the skulls of sacrifice victims. Most of the relics are kept in the very modern Museo del Templo Mayor. The stone that sparked the excavation work is in the place of honor in the center of the museum. The disc is decorated with a bas-relief portraying the goddess Coyolosh Hauqui, she who paints her face with bells, the Aztec moon goddess. Her body appears dismembered on the sculpted surface. According to legend, she was killed and cut to pieces by her brother, the god of war, who held her responsible for having tried to kill their mother, Coatlicue, goddess of the earth. Another wonderful relic in the museum, and the only one of its kind, is this terracotta statue of the Bat God, a divinity of the underworld for worship of the dead. There are also many masks portraying the deceased and mythological beings. The Aztec people were filled with supernatural and mythological tales. Elders spoke of a magical and rich city with splendid palaces that existed right here on Earth. The city was called Teotihuacan, the place where men became gods. These pyramids and ruins are what remains of this once majestic city. In the 4th and 5th centuries, the 6th largest city in the world. When the Aztecs lived, the place was abandoned, partially swallowed up by the jungle. But the Aztecs still believed that the incredible pyramids were built by the gods thousands of years earlier, and they made pilgrimages to the site. Archaeologists found that the city of Teotihuacan was established in 200 BC by the peoples of the Mexico Valley. The pyramids, some of the most extraordinary monuments in the Americas, were built around 200 AD. At its zenith, Teotihuacan had grown to cover an area of almost 8 square miles and had almost 200,000 inhabitants. The monumental complex lies in the high Anahuac Valley in a barren and arid landscape that heightens its magical and mysterious atmosphere. It now attracts numerous people who gather here regularly to celebrate the rite of the Salute to the Sun. The city is bisected by a grand avenue, 130 feet wide and over a mile long, that is called the Avenue of the Dead. To the east stands Tenochtitlan, a building complex rich in murals. The paintings depict Tlalocan, a paradise with abundant water, butterflies, and flowers. Tlalocan was the world that was governed by Tlaloc, the god of rain. At the end of the Avenue of the Dead is the Ciutadela, the citadel, at whose center stands the pyramid dedicated to the god Quetzalcoatl. It is one of the most important buildings in the area. Next to its base are statues carved out of limestone and painted with natural pigments that used to decorate the pyramid. They represent the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl. Originally, they were painted in bright colors. The undulating bodies of the serpents emerged from the walls of the pyramids, and the god's head was wreathed in a crown of feathers. In 1986, the excavations of the Ciutadela yielded an exceptional find, a sepulchre with the skeletons of 18 priests killed during a sacrifice. Until then, it was believed that only prisoners, slaves, or enemies were sacrificed on the altars. Here was proof that the rite of sacrifice did not discriminate. The most imposing sight, however, is in the Plaza del Sol. Along with the ruins of an altar and several temples stands the Pyramid of the Sun. 230 feet tall, 740 feet long on each side of the base, it is almost as big as the Egyptian Pyramid of Cheops at Giza, one of the 7 wonders of the world. Thousands of tourists make the steep but memorable climb to the top, a perfect place to take in the majesty of the entire complex. Ancient civilizations believed that both the sun and the moon were created at this site. From here you can also see the other great pyramid of Teotihuacan, the Pyramid of the Moon. Smaller than the Sun Pyramid, it's 130 feet high with a square base measuring 460 feet on each side. Yet despite these structures that have seemed to last an eternity, no one has figured out why the city and the culture disappeared so suddenly. The end apparently came around 750 AD. Some archaeologists feel the city was destroyed and burned, and its inhabitants fled. But no one knows who was responsible for the massacre, or what became of the survivors. Other experts have linked the decline of Teotihuacan simply to a change in the climate, which may have caused the already dry area to become uninhabitable. But that would not explain the fires and the devastation. Thus, the mystery of the lost city of Teotihuacan, where men became gods, lives on. One of the most incredible finds in the history of Mexican archaeology is the Sunstone. Miraculously escaping the fury of the Spanish, it was found in 1790 in Mexico City and incorporated into the eastern facade of the cathedral. The fascinating symbols incised into this Aztec treasure placed it at the center of numerous religious events. The relic can now be seen at the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City, a museum that contains many testaments to the origins and the histories of the peoples who populated Central America over the course of the millennia. A beautifully sculpted monkey-shaped receptacle made of extremely fragile black obsidian, heads carved in volcanic rock with eyes and teeth made of mother-of-pearl and pupils of pyrite, terracotta pipes, musical instruments, and thousands of other objects from the great Aztec culture. But perhaps the most precious is the Sunstone. Archaeologists studied the disk for years in an attempt to reveal the mystery of its symbols. Today, they think they have the answer. The Sunstone is a calendar, actually a double calendar. The complicated symbols refer both to a division of time based on religious precepts, where the solar year is 260 days long, and to a non-religious one, which divides the year exactly into 365 days. Other symbols describe the life of the planet, breaking it down into 5 solar ages, the so-called cosmogonic suns, and date the creation of the world to the 13th of August, 3114 BC, and its end to the 22nd of December, 2012. There are different interpretations, and there are certainly many mysteries still hidden in the signs inscribed on the Sunstone by wise hands. Perhaps time alone can give us the final answer. Mexico City today is one of the world's largest capitals, and unfortunately, one of the most polluted, with millions of vehicles. It is a city of contradictions, where skyscrapers crowd the center and miserable shanties form a belt in the vast outskirts. Much has been done to restore dignity to the Indios, the direct descendants of the Aztecs, but the wounds inflicted by a brutal conquest half a millennium ago are still visible everywhere you look. There is one area, however, in the south of the city, where one can still find solace in the ancient ways. Called Xochimilco, this part of the modern city still conserves characteristics of the ancient Tenochtitlán. It has canals that wind among the chinampas, the floating gardens that were obtained by draining the swampland, the same technique that allowed the Aztecs to create their capital. On Sundays, the zone becomes crowded with people having their meals on brightly colored boats, with mariachi bands playing music, singing of unrequited love, sad songs, just like this poem written over 500 years ago by an Aztec prince. Shall I thus pass away like the flowers that fade? Will there be nothing left of my name, nothing of my fame on earth? Let there at least be flowers. Let there at least be song. What can my heart do? Without purpose, we passed through this world. But they did have a purpose. The Aztec warriors and the rulers who gave their lives in defense of this great civilization may indeed have felt a desperation at the end. But there is something left of their fame on earth. And the flowers are here too. But they're made of stone, and they're called pyramids. And they have the sun to crown them for all eternity. The Phoenicians originally came from what is modern-day Lebanon. They were organized into city-states, the most important of which was Tyre, whose magnificent Roman ruins are still standing. The easiest way for Phoenicians to increase their prosperity was by contact with other peoples, and the quickest route to new lands and cultures was the Mediterranean. They soon became outstanding sailors and astute traders, indeed the very best. They learned to recognize products that people wanted to acquire and those they wanted to trade. And they started sailing and trading as far back as the 2nd millennium BC. To support their trade, they set up ports and founded colonies, built warehouses, and created a network of routes that touched on neighboring countries such as Egypt, Greece, the Magna Graecia, and Carthage in North Africa. Then they went on to reach Sardinia, the Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts of Spain, and farther south, along the coast as far as Senegal, and north to England and Ireland. A network of this size with hundreds of colonies and thousands of ships had to be well coordinated. For years, scholars speculated as to how the Phoenicians were able to communicate with each other in those remote times, to organize warehouses and trade in such a variety of goods. It was the discovery of this sarcophagus of the Phoenician king Ahiram, which dates back to the 13th century BC, that enabled archaeologists to understand the reasons for such great organizational skills. Engraved on the sarcophagus is the most ancient example of writing in alphabet form. It is composed of letters and not hieroglyphics. The Phoenicians were the first to invent an alphabet, a factor that proved indispensable in establishing their great trading network. We can get an idea of how extraordinary this innovation was from this comparison. On the right, we see 2 Egyptian hieroglyphics, and on the left, 2 letters from the Phoenician alphabet, an M and an H. By assembling these letters, the reader now didn't have to interpret a concept represented by a hieroglyphic or picture. He had a specific code that always remained the same and had the same meaning for whomever was reading it. The commanders of the Phoenician fleets had to have many skills. They not only needed expert knowledge of the sea and foreign lands, but they had to know the art of trading as well, what to buy, what to sell. One precious cargo of theirs was the mythical cedar of Lebanon, an excellent timber for building sturdy cargo vessels and warships. The timber could be bought in Baalbek, situated in the mountains that formed a backdrop to the Phoenician cities in Lebanon. In the Hellenistic period, the city of Baalbek was known as Heliopolis, City of the Sun. By studying the meaning of these swastikas and other evidence, such as the different colors of columns at this site, archaeologists discovered that the enormous temple that dominated the city was dedicated to the sun god, after which the city was named. But why were the columns painted in different colors? The mystery can be solved when the columns are linked to the cardinal points. The dark columns were placed to the west, while the lighter colored columns were set to the east. They were supposed to represent life and death, the rising and setting of the sun. In 60 AD, the Cella of the sun god was the most important construction in the entire sacred area, with 54 columns over 60 feet high, more than 6 feet in diameter. Having loaded the trunks of cedar wood onto carts, the traders would return to the coast where their ships awaited them. In the Bible, Ezekiel mentions that the Phoenician city of Byblus, which also lies in Lebanon, was the biggest naval shipyard in ancient times. Crossing the seas was not an easy matter, even with a good ship. This was one of the reasons why help from the gods was sought throughout the Mediterranean. These precious bronze statues covered in gold leaf have a strange headdress. It is a libad, which is typical of the Phoenicians. The statues have been found in great quantities in Byblus. They were votive objects used to invoke the favor of the gods. They were found at one of the most important places of worship for the Phoenician religion, the Temple of the Obelisks. In Byblus and other Phoenician cities, the remains of numerous Phoenician cargo ships have been found. The typical ship was 65 feet long and over 16 feet wide, large enough to carry a great deal of the precious cedar, as well as luxurious fabrics dyed with a reddish-purple pigment known as murex. The Phoenicians took their name from these fabrics. Phoenix, Phoenician, comes from the Greek word phoin, or red. This precious cargo could have been exchanged in any port. But a wise fleet's commander might seek out a product that could be worth its weight in gold, a kouros. A kouros is an exemplary model of harmony and proportion in the male body. Many of these statues, dating from the Archaic period, were discovered on the island of Rhodes near Comoros. Excavations nearby unearthed these celebrated vases, which are known as the vases of Ficalura. This concentration of arts and craftsmanship on this island can be explained by the fact that Rhodes lay at the hub of important trading routes. To break up the long sea journeys, the ships sailed from island to island, and Rhodes was an obligatory port of call. Here is the dry dock, or coffin, of the colony, which has been preserved intact for millennia. Here the Greeks were offered the fabrics and cedar for their ships. In return, the Phoenicians were given exquisitely decorated pottery and objects from all over Greece, including beautiful Greek statues like this one, as well as bronzes produced in the Magna Graecia, which may have been ordered by a rich Phoenician resident in a distant colony. Statues like this ephebe in bronze, or the famous Youth of Mothia, were found during excavations in the ancient Phoenician colony of Mothia in Sicily. The statues testify to the level of Phoenician trading in the Mediterranean, a veritable cross-cultural exchange. The ship, now loaded with vases, statues, and jewels, continues its journey to the west. It sails past the Pillars of Hercules at the Isthmus of Gibraltar and heads south along the Atlantic beaches of Africa between Morocco and Guinea. The Phoenicians were the only people brave enough to venture into the Atlantic. Ancient peoples were terrified of passing the Pillars of Hercules because they believed that beyond lay the end of the world. What was it that pushed the Phoenicians so far? The Greek historian Herodotus documented it in his writings. It was gold. The Phoenicians unload the merchandise and lay it out on the shore. Then they go back on board their ships and send up smoke. The locals see the smoke and place the gold that they are offering in exchange beside the merchandise. Then they withdraw. The Phoenicians descend from their ships and examine it. If they calculate that the quantity of gold corresponds to the value of their merchandise, they take it and leave. Otherwise, they go back to their ships and wait until they are satisfied. The African peoples were very taken with the showy Eastern goods and quite indifferent to the yellow metal that was found in such abundance there. This was the great bargain for the Phoenicians, leaving inexpensive pottery and jewelry and setting off again with gold. The ship would now head north. Excavations in England and Ireland have revealed that the Phoenicians reached even these far-off lands. Numerous finds have indicated that in exchange for pottery and jewelry, the northern peoples gave tin, a metal that was in great demand for producing bronze and the other alloys used by the Phoenicians and Greeks. Ireland was the most northerly landing point for Phoenician voyages, and having traded their goods, the sailors could now make the return journey. The trips always held the portent of danger. In the storms of the North Atlantic, the brave commanders would safeguard their ships and cargoes by tying themselves to the bow so that they could see more clearly and avoid the cliffs. It was from there that they gave instructions to the crew. If they were lucky enough to make it through, they would head south to the Phoenician colony of Cadiz. Here the Phoenicians bought iron and paid for it with gold. Then they traveled on to Majorca, and from there to the rich colonies of Sardinia. It's here that an archaeological dig uncovered a gold mine, not a seam or stratum of gold, but a huge array of precious gold jewelry, now on display in the Archaeological Museum in Cagliari. Since Sardinia has never had gold deposits, the precious metal must have come from Africa on Phoenician ships. In the Sardinian colonies, the Phoenicians themselves worked the gold into the most exclusive forms, modeling it in small molds. Sardinia was the largest producer of Phoenician crafts, especially in the field of glassmaking. They made ointment jars to hold balms and perfumes, necklaces, and characteristic amulets. For centuries, it was believed the Phoenicians invented glass. While science no longer holds with this theory, they definitely were peerless masters in the field of glassmaking. For many years, archaeologists pondered the reason for the ambiguous smile on grinning masks like this one. They also didn't know the reason for the long arms on certain statues. Only after years of research did they find the answers. The masks were used to ward off evil spirits from the tombs. As for the statues, they were related to the more esoteric aspects of Phoenician medicine. They were offered to the gods to invoke a speedy recovery from illness. The affliction to be cured was in the exact spot touched by the hands, almost as if the sick person wanted to remind the gods what needed to be healed. Walls and the sea. A combination like this generally implies that we are dealing with a Phoenician emporium or trading center. The archaeological site of Tharos in Sardinia may not have any large architectural structures still standing, but it is one of the most eloquent when it comes to ancient urban design. Here, Phoenicians would have traded the iron, lead, and part of the tin and gold they had for precious jewels. Tharos was one of the largest producers of jewelry of the period. Among the many Phoenician remains here is a completely extraneous round construction called a nuraghe that was typical of the Pelites, the ancient inhabitants of Sardinia who were conquered by the Phoenicians. This is how the village would have looked about 3,000 years ago. The Nuraghic civilization is very ancient, dating back to the 2nd millennium BC. Their settlements were very compact, with narrow winding streets which made it easier to defend the village from enemy incursions. The houses of the ancient Sardinian people were a combination of fortified towers, granaries, workshops, and dwelling places. There was no distinction made between the function of the various constructions. There was only the nuraghe, a unit where productive and family activities were carried out around a fire, the main focus of the house. But what exactly does the word nuraghe mean? It seems to come from the way their dwelling was constructed. In the ancient local language, nur meant mound. As we can see, the walls of the constructions are thicker than the dwelling area. They were built with heavy stones heaped on top of each other without the use of mortar. The constructions reached heights of more than 65 feet without using any lime, and they are indeed mound-like. Phoenician ports, like this one in Nora, all had something in common. They were situated near promontories. In this way, ships could be moored on both sides of the promontories, creating a larger dock area. The only thing the Phoenicians looked for was to be able to land quickly, get their business done, and then set sail again. These are the foundations of the Phoenician quarter in Nora. Although it's worlds away from the Romans' concept of living, with the Romans preferring large, orderly quarters equipped with many services and amenities, the Phoenicians did share the Romans' love of thermal baths. The baths here in Nora are decorated with rich mosaics. The theater here is also quite spectacular. Dating from the 2nd century AD, it is one of the most fascinating monuments in all of Sardinia. From this Spartan 5th century Phoenician port, the fleet would have set sail again, now laden down with even more jewels and precious objects. One of the greatest archaeological mysteries regarded the port of Carthage, Queen of the Mediterranean, the most powerful of all Phoenician colonies. The Greek historian Appian, a native of Alexandria in Egypt, tells us that the port had 2 harbors, the rectangular commercial port and the round military harbor with an island in the center. However, in modern times, no place seemed to correspond to that description until in the 19th century, the writer René Chateaubriand noticed these 2 lagoons near the bay of Le Cram were very similar in shape to the ports mentioned. He realized that this was Carthage. This discovery led to a heated debate, which was only concluded with excavations carried out in 1974. A British team, excavating on the circular island, found evidence that confirmed Chateaubriand's theory. The bustling port of Carthage was the largest and most modern port in pre-Roman times. Warships would pass from the commercial port through a narrow passage to the military harbor. Merchant ships were forbidden to pass beyond this limit. The ship that is entering the port is a trireme with 3 tiers of rowers, though the Carthaginians also had quadriremes and quinquiremes, which can be compared to modern-day battleships. All the ships returning from war missions, by which Carthage dominated the Mediterranean and protected Phoenician trading routes, were moored in this port. It was circular, with a round island in the center, known as the Island of the Admiralty. There were dry docks both on the island and in the outer perimeter of the port. On the summit of the island was the Pavilion of the Admiralty, from which the supreme commander of the fleet gave military orders. A bugler and a herald, armed with flags, controlled the traffic of ships in the port. If a trumpeter signaled to turn left, there had to be room enough to make the maneuver. The basin of water in which the ships moved was thus over 300 feet wide, the same diameter as the Island of the Admiralty on our right. There were 30 berths in the center and 140 on the outside. Since some of the very deep central moorings could hold 2 ships, there could have been 200 ships in the port at one time. The military port in Carthage was always packed in winter, since bad weather made it dangerous for the ships to be out on rough seas. Thus, there was a tendency to avoid war during this time, and this was a good time to service the ships. The trireme would be pulled up onto dry land over the slightly sloping terrain of the island. Planks of wood set crossways ensured that the ships kept their grip on the slipway. At the entrance to the area, Ionic columns set at sea level gave the impression of a portico to make this military site look more elegant. The ships were also given special aesthetic treatment. Phoenician ships typically had an eye painted on the bow that was supposed to strike fear into their enemies. A warship differed from a cargo ship in that it had oars and oarsmen that enabled it to move very quickly. As well as being outstanding sailors, the Phoenicians excelled at shipbuilding. They mass-produced ships and replaced the vessels sunk by their enemies with great speed. All the parts of the ship were clearly marked by different letters and kept ready for quick assembly. In this way, they could build an entire fleet in a short period of time. The busy commercial part of Carthage, however, was the Bursa, the Acropolis of Carthage. This is where the major transactions, the trades and selling of jewelry and glasswork brought from Sardinia, would take place. These goods were in great demand in Carthage. On their way home, the ships might also sail up the Nile to the grand and mysterious kingdoms of the pharaohs. Despite the fact that Egyptians followed the cult of the hereafter, the royalty adored earthly treasures. The Phoenicians would have traded the jewelry from Pharos for linen, a hard-wearing fabric that only the Egyptians knew how to make. This material was indispensable for the robust sails used on Phoenician ships. They might also have purchased rare and exotic goods greatly sought after at the Persian court, namely monkeys and crocodiles. Finally, completing the loop and reaching the town of Tyre, they could sell the exotic animals to the Persians and the linen to their fellow countrymen. They'd be left with gold, silver, and a lot more money than they would have paid for the cedar back in Baalbek. Through their travels and their trading, their ancient wheeling and dealing, the Phoenicians formed links with most of the known world at that time, enabling a variety of peoples to share the best that distant cultures had to offer. The Phoenicians, undisputedly, the master merchants of the Mediterranean. Which proved to be formidable war machines. The conquistadors inadvertently brought another devastating weapon, a viral disease, smallpox. Smallpox found virgin territory in the New World. Millions died, over 2/3 of the Aztec population. Among them, the last king, Cuauhtémoc, whose death marked the end of the great ancient civilization of the Aztecs. Maybe if there were no disease, the Aztec soldiers might have fared better against the invaders. They were considered noble warriors and often used predators like eagles as their symbols of strength. These 6-foot statues, now in the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City, depict sacred cycles. This meant that Quetzalcoatl would soon return, and that's what Montezuma thought when he heard of the floating mountain on the sea. But in 1519, it was not a god that arrived, but conquistador Hernán Cortés. And the floating mountain was a Spanish galleon full of soldiers and weapons. Thinking he was a god, the Aztecs received Cortés with honors and adulation. In return, Cortés went on to destroy the Aztec capital and exterminate its population. Montezuma died, and his successor, Cuitlahuac, was forced to surrender. But how was such a rout possible? The invaders wielded devastating weapons and equipment completely unknown to the indigenous population. Cannons, rifles, pistols, and horses. Picked how they would have looked. The statues once guarded the gates to a temple called, appropriately, Temple of the Warriors. Tenochtitlán was a grand city that stood in the middle of a large lake on a plateau surrounded by mountains. The first inhabitants of the area were tenacious souls who did not shy away from hardship. They transformed their settlement into one of the most extensive and populous metropolises of the then-known world. Their projects included dams, canals, and the draining of swamps. When the soldiers would come back from victorious battles with their spoils of war, they would visit the big market of Tlatelolco. Here they might try to bargain for some precious fabric or rare bird feathers to enrich their attire. Tenochtitlán. This was the capital and the heart of the grandiose Aztec Empire. The monarch, who had the power of life and death over his subjects, was Montezuma II, descendant of another Montezuma, the great leader who founded the empire and built the grand monuments at Tenochtitlan. Like his ancestor, Montezuma was a highly religious sovereign, particularly devoted to the god Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, to whom hundreds of temples were dedicated. Quetzalcoatl was an extremely benevolent god, the only god in the Aztec pantheon opposed to human sacrifices. The sacred texts state that the god had left the land promising that he would return to redeem his people. And according to the Aztec calendar, the year 1519, by our current calendar, ended one of the sacred. In Mexico City, during excavation work in 1978 near the cathedral, a heavy slab was unearthed, decorated with magnificent bas-reliefs that someone a very long time ago had smashed and buried. Researchers wondered who could have smashed this beautiful work of art, and why. To find these answers, we have to go back in time to the year 1519, when Mexico City, one of the world's largest and most populated cities, did not yet exist. In its place was an extraordinary and incredible city